Hello, Honors 100. Hope everyone had a great Labor Day. For today's class, I just want to start off with a few quick notes, mostly coming out of the live session that I hosted late last week. A couple questions that came up that I think were really good ones. One was about notes on notifications, individual messages that some students are getting every time someone posts in one of our discussion threads that I've heard can become a little bit overwhelming. There are settings to turn off getting those notifications. I believe there are two separate levels. One where you don't get any notifications via email, and one where you might get a digest version of it where you only get one a day that kind of summarizes all of them. So I'm going to put some notes. One of my students from another class wrote up a helpful kind of list of instructions in terms of how to adjust your settings on that. I'm sure some of you have probably figured this out on your own. It's a little different from my end, so that's part of where it's difficult for me to directly give you the suggestions. I'm going to copy and paste what that student provided me into the discussion thread below, so you'll be able to see that. If you have been getting overwhelmed with all the notifications, I apologize for that being the case. I know that can be at least an annoyance, and so if you do have trouble figuring out where to go to change your settings on that, again, hopefully those instructions will help you, and I'm happy to help try to help troubleshoot. Again, my view is a little different, so my ability to help you with that might have some limitations in and of itself, but I think together we can figure this out and make it manageable for everyone. The other point I want to bring up, a question came up about participating in the discussion threads via video or audio response as opposed to just writing responses. I am okay with that. I'm going to do that with the caveat that I think by default I would still suggest text responses just because some of your peers might be in a position where it's difficult to be able to listen to comments as consistently, or might have bandwidth issues where it's harder to watch another video than it is to just read through comments. So by default, if it's all the same to you, I'm going to recommend staying with written comments. But if you're someone who's really struggling to be able to write your comments in kind of an effective way for the purposes of these discussions, or you're taking a long time to do it where it'd be much easier for you just to be able to speak it, I will entertain that. If you'd like to try submitting them that way, at least on a trial basis, we'll kind of see how that goes, and then we'll adjust accordingly. But I am open to that. We're all kind of still figuring out this online mode of education, and I think that's a reasonable thing for us to try out. Next thing I wanted to get into was the initial artifact analysis assignment. So that is due by next class, 11 a.m., so Tuesday of next week. Not Tuesday, Monday of next week. Excuse me, I'm mixing up my classes here. So for that assignment, I just wanted to kind of highlight, again, some of what it's looking for. So this is not a thesis-driven essay. So this is not an argumentative essay. It's not like the 5-paragraph essay assessment I asked you to do earlier. You should not have a thesis statement for this assignment. And I'll say it one more time, no thesis statements for this assignment. I know that's a little bit unusual for some folks who are really used to that kind of essay writing, and we're going to get there in this class. And for, I'd say, probably a majority of the papers you're writing in college after that point, depending on your discipline, you probably will have thesis statements and central arguments you're proving. For the purposes of this exercise, we're kind of building towards those more argumentative essays. So at this point, you're just using your artifact and you're doing some analytical work on it. As many of you did for the folklore album cover that I posted last time, as I walked you through with that U2 album cover that I shared. Basically, you're just looking for things like patterns that you see in your artifact, moments where you notice something kind of stands out, what kind of emotional, logical appeals to credibility you kind of see going on there, what details you notice and what you think they mean. That's generally what we're looking for. So again, no argument, no outside research intended for this one. Beyond, if you want to look up the year that something was produced, I'll allow that, but really, the purpose of this is not for it to be a research paper, not to forge an argument, but rather just to look at, listen to, experience your artifact by whatever means it's kind of communicated, and give us some sense of what you think it means, what it's doing, how it's operating. So with that, though, one of the most essential pieces of this assignment is successfully picking an artifact. I alluded to this in my previous posts here. if your artifact is something too large, or if it's something too simple and too small, it can be really difficult to do well on this assignment. In fact, I would say if you have a big artifact, like a full movie or a full book, something like that, it's kind of impossible to do a good job on this assignment. I think you're the very best I can imagine a student doing an assignment would be a C-level paper, I think, at least from past experience. Just because when it's that big, you can't possibly take on all the detail and nuance in any kind of effective way in a 2 to 3 page paper, right? It's just not realistic. So again, some ideas of good kinds of artifacts, things like music videos or songs, things like commercials, things like movie trailers, a single chapter of a book, a single scene from a play, a single poem, anything along those lines. Something that, as a general rule of thumb, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, and I can see going either side of this, but roughly 1 to 5 minutes, I would say, is a good span of how long it would take to digest this thing, to watch it, to listen to it, to read it, depending on the medium you're thinking of. In service of kind of making sure everyone's on the right track with this part of the class, or to catch it if folks are just feeling kind of lost about this aspect of it, one of the main threads of discussion I'm going to open below is going to be about telling us what artifact or artifacts you're thinking about right now. So I hope most folks have already given some thought to this, but you can participate in the discussion thread and just let us know what artifact you're thinking of. If it's something that's easy to produce the clip of or an image of, all the better. Feel free to do that below. Otherwise, you can just, in a sentence or two, just describe what you're thinking of. The motivation, again, is mostly so I can see that you're on the right track with the artifacts. Again, if it's not the right kind of artifact, all of a sudden it becomes almost impossible to do well on this assignment. Having a good artifact doesn't guarantee that you're going to do well on the assignment, but it's the first step in that direction, right? So I want to make sure everyone's at least reasonably set up from that first step. And if you don't know what kind of artifact you're thinking of, if you're a little bit lost on this or you're just kind of stumped for what you want to use for this, feel free to weigh in with questions on that thread as well. If you don't have an artifact in mind yet, please still participate in that thread just with some idea of the kinds of things you're thinking of or what questions you have, what's kind of tripping you up. I'll respond to those questions, but also your class might weigh in and explain it in a different way that might be more effective than how I'm explaining it. But please give some sense, again, just because it's such an important part of this process. And if you don't have an artifact yet going into the tail end of this week, you're going to be falling a little behind on this assignment. It's going to be difficult to recover, so we want to make sure everyone's on the right point here. So I'll put that in the discussion thread below, and again, I'll be monitoring that and kind of will weigh in. And consider no news to be good news. As with most comments, I've mentioned this before, and I think most folks are understanding it, but it's hard for me to respond to every discussion thread post. It's hard for me to give an elaborate response to every reading response journal. If you get credit for the reading response journals, that means I'm acknowledging you completed it. You're good. No news is good news. And similarly on the discussion threads, I'm giving the thumbs up. I'm liking the posts just to acknowledge that I have read them. Other students might be liking it as well, so you might see multiple likes. But if you see just one like, it's probably me liking it, just acknowledging that I've seen your comment. And I usually will weigh in if I have more to say about that, or if I want to elaborate a point, ask a follow-up question, or if I want to really correct something that I feel is kind of off base. Similarly, for these artifacts, I might leave some comments, especially to the people who comment early, just to endorse, yes, that's a great example. That's a good artifact to use. Whereas for other students, if I do feel that there's problematic, I may either leave a comment there or message you privately, depending on the nature of the issue that I'm seeing, to again, just kind of correct course and make sure we're in a good place as we start off with this assignment. Okay, so that's the initial artifact analysis. Again, be thinking about it. Remember, you have less than a week now before that's due, and it's a pretty short assignment. So if you haven't really started yet, that's fine, right? I mean, I think if you haven't yet thought about artifacts or started to narrow in on which one you're going to use, that's where you might be falling a little behind now. That's where I basically want students to be today, and then over these next couple days, be working on writing your first draft of this assignment, and then giving yourself a little bit of time to go back and polish things. Speaking of which, though, that's a good segue to our reading for today, which was an excerpt from Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird. Excuse my language here. I'm going to use the same language that she uses, which does involve some profanity. I know some folks aren't as comfortable with that. Others, some folks I think enjoy that. So wherever you fall on that spectrum, but no, I'm not trying to curse at you just for the sake of cursing, but rather just referencing what Lamott wrote. So it's called Shitty First Drafts. And that's actually where I wanted to start with this thing. The title itself, I would suggest, is pretty provocative, right? It stands out. I doubt you've had very many reading assignments that the first word of the title is profanity, right? Why she chose to do that. And it's not a trick question. I think there's at least a couple of relatively obvious reasons that we can deduce why she would do that, and some room for interpretation too. But why you think that Lamont made this choice in terms of what she named this piece. Then so I'm going to take just to a couple. And obviously, it was a pretty short reading, so we're not going to go into a ton of depth just because there's not necessarily a ton of depth available to us here. But I think it's pages 25 to 26 here. So scrolling down a little bit, this is getting into page 3 of the PDF file that I sent you, but with page numbers reproduced at the bottom of the page. I'm going to read this last paragraph of 25 into the beginning of page 26. So it says, almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting anything down on paper. A friend of mine says that the first draft is the down draft. You just get it down. The second draft is the up draft. You fix it up. You try to say what you have to say more accurately. And the third draft is the dental draft, where you check every tooth to see if it's loose or cramped or decayed, or even, God help us, healthy. I really like this paragraph. I think it's to me one of the more important paragraphs of this chapter that I've given you, just for this sense of the iteration, the kind of iterative process that is drafting. I had a really good friend. I still have this friend. He's a friend of mine to this day, but he's not a writer by nature. And we used to go back and forth on this a lot, where his insistence was, I just want to get it right on the first draft so I don't have to go back and do it over and over again, even if that first draft takes longer. In principle, that's okay, right? It's always a spectrum, a range of ways that people do this stuff. Some people spend longer on the first draft and less time on follow-up drafts. Some people breeze through that first draft with the full expectation they're going back for future drafts to polish things up. I often suggest, and I'll give you my full transparency, that it's my process. It's what I kind of favor. Expecting your first draft is not going to be perfect. Because again, as Lamont kind of emphasizes, as I would say from my own experience, even for a professional writer, that's extremely rare, that a first draft is going to be polished and publishable, or going to get you an A on an assignment, or so on and so forth. Expecting that it's valuable to have this multiple iteration process, a multiple draft process, where you just get everything out at first, right? And I guess, again, especially for folks who don't consider themselves great writers, who struggle with this process, that can be the most intimidating thing, is just trying to get it right on the first go through. So take that pressure off of yourself, right? Just try to get it down. Some people, I've had students even benefit, and this works again differently for everyone, but for example, for this initial artifact analysis assignment, saying I'm only going to spend a half hour on this first draft, or at least I'm going to set a timer for 30 minutes. I'm going to get as much as I can get done as possible without going back to reread anything, without fixing my grammar, without worrying about structure. And I think that can be pretty liberating. And oftentimes once you have that draft, you have something to work with, and it's easy to go back and iron out the parts that are not as successful. The next point I want to go to is on page 27, the next page of your PDF, the last page actually here. Let's see, and this is, so she gets into this image of mice. It's the big kind of meaty paragraph on page 27 here. I'm probably not going to read the whole thing, but I'll start reading this. Close your eyes and get quiet for a minute until the chatter starts up. Then isolate one of the voices and imagine the person speaking as a mouse. Again, these are kind of all the competing priorities, all the kind of critics, everyone you kind of might have in your ear as you're writing. To go back to the text here, pick it up by the tail and drop it into a mason jar. Then isolate another voice, pick it up by the tail and drop it in the mason jar, and so on. Drop it in any high-maintenance parental units, drop in any contractors, lawyers, colleagues, children, anyone who is whining in your head. Then put the lid on and watch all of these mouse people clawing at the glass, jabbering away, trying to make you feel like shit because you won't do what they want. Won't give them more money, won't be more successful, won't see them more often. And I'll leave it there. It goes on from there, right? I'm going to leave this relatively open-ended here. I'm curious of reactions to this. What is Lamott saying when she suggests kind of taking all of these different voices, turning them into mice and putting them in a jar? That's a pretty elaborate image she's constructing there, right? But I think it's a pretty clear message what she's getting across. So I am interested in what students make of that, what your reactions are. But I'm going to leave it there. I'm again, as always, open for other thoughts, observations, reflections. A few of you have already done really good reading response journal entries to this, and I look forward to reading them from other students. Because again, I think part of the value of this particular chapter is that it's relatable. And for some of you, it might be you're further along in your writing process, you kind of have it down. And one thing, I think I've said it before in these videos, and I'm sure I'll say it again before the end of the semester, I never want to correct someone or tell someone how to do something if they're already doing it well, right? If you're doing it well, you're happy with the results, you're getting good grades on these assignments, you're succeeding by whatever metrics you consider to be success, I'm not going to tell you have to do it a different way. But I find when students are early in their college career, and even when tends to be when they're late in their college career, as writers, they're not always really happy with their writing process. There's often room for more, if not improvement, at least experimentation and trying to do things a different way. So I think that this chapter from Lamott really sort of invites that, because I know some students are already doing things like this, depending on who your high school teachers were, whether outside influences you have. But some people I think haven't really even thought of writing in this way of kind of drafts and redoing it. So I think that can be something that has practical hands-on kind of application for folks. But okay, so that's the reading for today, and that's pretty much today's class. I want to give a heads up for our next reading by Chuck Klosterman. There is some further profanity included in there. He talks about sex in some pretty open ways, not sort of gratuitous or going over the top with the imagery, but he does reference it pretty blatantly. And it's sort of an informal style of this thing, and he's making an argument on his own. I think it's a fun reading. I hope you'll feel sort of the same way. So some of his references are a little bit dated or a little bit problematic now, because this was published a good, whatever it was, 15 years or so ago. He references, Woody Allen, for example, who we'll talk about next time, has become sort of a problematic figure. The way the Klosterman's talking about him, I don't think is as problematic, but rest assured, we'll get there for those who might kind of raise an eyebrow and kind of be concerned that we're looking at him through this lens. But I'll leave it there. So again, in the discussion thread, please be sure to leave an idea of what artifact or artifacts you're thinking about at this point, or questions on that process if you have them. And you're only obligated to leave one comment of substance, but I would also love to hear some discussion of what we think of the Anne Lamott reading as well. But thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.